All right, welcome everybody to the Hoover Museum. Is this anyone's first time to come see us? All right, so I'll just give you a shameless plug while you're all sitting here. In the galleries, we have Matt's exhibit, which I encourage everybody to come and take a look at while you're here. Adjacent to that, we have America's First Ladies. It's not a traveling show. We put it together and brought in artifacts from all over the country. And we have an artifact from every single First Lady, starting with Martha Washington on up to Michelle Obama. So I would strongly encourage you guys to visit that. It comes down in October. My name is Elizabeth Dinchell. I'm the education specialist here. I put together this program with Matt. I've had teachers working with Matt and Elizabeth Partridge, who's talking at 2 o'clock all week, and we talked about the power of photography and artifacts and oral histories in the classroom and what that can do to transform how our students interpret history and how they accept history and how they think about history, because overall we really want to encourage our students to think and not just remember dates and times and places, but to think about impact. Following the signing of the 13th Amendment, Black Americans were free, but not free like white Americans. They were not paid the same. They did not share neighborhoods with other races, and they could not vote. They were not equal. Jim Crow laws and Plessy versus Ferguson, the legal precedent of separate but equal, was the day-to-day reality for most African Americans. As human nature would dictate, the people had enough. Everyday activities for white people, such as sitting at lunch counters, registering for college, and refusing to give up a bus seat when carried out by blacks, became national headlines. In 1957, 9 children in Little Rock attempting to attend high school invoked the use of the Arkansas National Guard and the U.S. military to protect opposing national and state interests. The understated story of the Civil Rights Movement was the profound and very real danger that every single African American person in the United States faced, whether they actively participated in the movement or not. Despite the fear, threats, and imminent danger that Black Americans faced, especially in the South, they used the legal system, civil disobedience, and nonviolent demonstrations to fight for equal protection and rights under the United States Constitution. In an article published in 2011, Hamden Rice, an African-American writer, wrote, "Once people had been beaten, had dogs sicked on them, had fire hoses sprayed on them, and had been thrown in jail. You know what happened? These magnificent young black people began singing freedom songs in jail. That, my friends, is what ended the terrorism of the South. Confronting your worst fears, living through it, and breaking out in a deep-throated freedom song." Matthew Herron relocated his family to the South and captured some of our history's most iconic images of freedom marches, demonstrations, and civil disobedience. This year, our country celebrates the 50th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Matt was present with his camera during the Third Selma March, which ultimately led to the signing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. With a sharp eye, training from Minor White, and mentorship from Dorothea Lange, Matt entered the South to use the power of his images to deliver the story of the Civil Rights Movement. Matt helped SNCC and organized a team of 8 photographers known as the Southern Documentary Project. Matt's product of activism, his photography, was printed in Life, Look, and Time magazines. He won the World Press Photo Contest in 1965 for a powerful image of a patrolman attacking a 5-year-old child. Even after leaving the South, Matt remained engaged in activism with Greenpeace and capturing end-of-life photos for AIDS patients when AIDS was still new and a very scary disease. It is with great pleasure I welcome Matthew Herron to share his experiences with me.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's a strange title, isn't it?
Yeah.
3 hats? What does 3 hats mean? Let me try to explain. Excuse me. In 1963, I was just beginning my budding career as a magazine photojournalist. Picture magazines were the mass media of the day. Everybody had a copy of Life on the coffee table. Television had not killed the magazines yet, so this was what I wanted to do. At the same time, my wife and I were organizing peace demonstrations for the Quakers in Philadelphia. And I got to the point where I could organize 1,000 well-dressed Quakers with neatly lettered signs surrounding Philadelphia City Hall. The police were very cooperative. They knew we were nonviolent, and everything was peachy keen. But a little voice woke me in the middle of the night and said to me, if you want to be relevant and you want to really practice nonviolence, which I was very concerned with, you've got to join those kids who are getting beaten up in lunch counters in the South. So in the summer of 1963, my wife Janine went first to Jackson to join the funeral marches for Medgar Evers. And her other assignment was to see whether our two small children, 3 and 5, would be safe if we moved south as a family. And she was told, if you live in Jackson and you keep your head down, you'll be fine. So we turned out we were the only family with children to move south and join the civil rights movement. Most of the people were college students, and the vanguard were young, mostly black, mostly guys, coming from colleges like Howard and so on, and joining with local indigenous leaders in small communities all over the South. So I thought of myself as wearing 3 hats when I went into this situation. First, there was the hat of the photojournalist, the news photographer, or somebody doing an extended picture essay for a magazine. But mostly the big things, the marches, the events, the bombings, all of that stuff. Secondly, I was wearing the hat of a civil rights propagandist. You know, the Nazis gave propaganda a bad name, but propaganda actually means, I think the definition comes up later, information in the service of a cause. Not objective by any means, but not necessarily either negative or positive. So I thought of myself not as a civil rights worker, but as sort of a consultant to the civil rights movement. I helped the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, set up darkroom in Atlanta. I trained photographers, and when I wasn't shooting for magazines, which was most of the time, I might be covering a demonstration or doing something for the civil rights movement. And those photographs were sent north, were published in black newspapers and other places. They were sent to friends of SNCC's group. The purpose was to raise money, but beyond that, to make clear to a wider audience, particularly in the North, what was going on in the South, because at that time, we were a very small group. Somebody said there were about 35 of us in Mississippi. And none of us knew whether this thing, which has now become a piece of history, would even be remembered, let alone be successful. We were just there because we had to be there. So hat number 2 was the straw field hat of the civil rights propagandist. And early in my photographic life, I had met the well-known photodocumentarian Dorothea Lange, who's best known for her work during the 30s and 40s, chronicling the Dust Bowl migration of people out of Arkansas and places like that to the California Central Valley. And I was not an intimate friend of Dorothea. I was a young photographer coming and saying, look at my awful photographs. And Dorothea did what a lot of us did in those days. She spent time with me. And during those brief periods, she changed my life. She convinced me that photography could be more than a neat profession. It could actually be a way of life, a way of relating to the larger world, and more than that, that my personal concerns about human rights and human liberation and justice and all that stuff could actually be a focus for my photography. I could marry those two things, my personal concerns and my profession. So my third hat was the pith helmet of the photo documentarian exploring the mores of American life. And in the South, I tried to document what it was like to be black, what it was like to live in a black community, what it was like to be white, how the two races related to each other. It wasn't news, it was the fabric of American life in the South. So I put this show together to kind of demonstrate these three approaches, and they intermingle. There were times when I would be on assignment and I would see things that I thought might be history, and I would take pictures that didn't relate to the assignment, but I was there in that situation, and so I'm going to do it. So I think we can go on to photographs now. I can make this thing work. So we'll start with photojournalism. This is the Selma March in 1965, the most important of the civil rights marches. And you see, whoops. Get this thing to work. Oh, not very good at this. Martin Luther King, John Lewis, who's now a long-time stable in the House of Representatives. And one of my favorite pictures, this kid wrote his convictions on his forehead. Everyone photographed him, including me. I think mine was the best picture of the day. That's my personal opinion. The march started out in Selma, one of the scariest towns in Alabama, and it went first through Lowndes County, Alabama. We were marching from Selma to Montgomery. It was 5 days. I spent the whole 5 days walking backwards. I don't remember what I ate, where I slept, how I cared for myself, but I remember vividly all those moments of photography. So Lowndes County had a black majority and 0 registered black voters. It was a place of great repression and a very hard place for a black person to live. So the folks came out of their houses and they saw thousands of white and black people marching freely through the heart of segregated Alabama. It was a vision they never expected to see. It changed their lives. And the next year with the Voting Rights Act, why Lowndes County started their own political party, and they elected, first of all, the person who affected their lives most. Not their legislator in Washington. They elected the sheriff. The sheriff was the guy they came up against most of the time. So as voting rights began to spread through the South, the first thing you saw were more and more black sheriffs in some of these black majority counties. So this is a woman. is just amazed at what she sees before her eyes. This is probably my best known photograph of Selma marchers approaching Montgomery. The American flag was a potent symbol in the South. If you carried an American flag, the message was, I want the laws of the United States to be enforced in the South. If you didn't believe that, you had a Confederate flag on the back of your pickup truck. So the flag is important. The airplane is a spotter plane by the U.S. Army looking for Klansmen hiding in the bushes. As the march went on, and my mind was thinking, how do I picture this? I thought, I need a march line against on the horizon against the sky. But there were trees and houses and all that stuff. So one day I started throwing myself into ditches and shooting up. And I made 2 frames here. In the first frame, every hand and every foot and every leg was out of place. It was just a mess. And then the deities that favor photographers smiled on me, and then the second frame was this one. And almost every individual is articulated and separate, and the hands are in the right place. And I didn't even know I had this picture for about 6 months. I shipped it all to New York, and when I saw it, I was amazed. And then my agency lost it for a while, and then I finally claimed it back. The last of the civil rights marches, probably the least known, was the journey of James Meredith from Memphis to Jackson, a lonely, solitary mission. And I got an assignment from the Saturday Evening Post to do a cover and to cover the Meredith March. So the day before this picture was taken, Meredith had marched into Jackson and given a speech in front of the state capitol with about 20,000 people following him. The next morning at 5, we go out on a deserted road leading from Jackson to Yazoo City. That road was in my mind. I had it there, and I knew someday I'm going to take a picture with that highway doing this, with kudzu vines filling the sides of it. And so Meredith had his signature pith helmet and cane with him. And as we were shooting, we'd wait for the cars to go away. There weren't any cars at that hour. This highway patrol car came up. And with great restraint, the highway patrolman said, "Mr. Meredith," said, "I wouldn't presume to tell you what to do, but there are a lot of folks in this state who don't feel very kindly about you. And I suggest that you close up what you're doing and before something bad happens." So Meredith didn't say a thing, but he turned to me, laughed toward, and he said, "Well, how long is this going to take?" And I took the picture and we went home. Elizabeth told you about singing. Singing was the heart and soul of the movement. It gave us strength. If folks were going out for a demonstration, they knew they were going to be arrested. They started by singing in the church before they went out. They sang on the march line. They sang in prison. The civil rights songs were the heart and soul of the movement. And today I judge anything by, is there singing? You know, that gave courage and gave strength and pulled us all together. So that's singing. This is a photograph I didn't discover until about 20 years after I took it. I looked at it and I thought, that's kind of a good picture. Why didn't I see that before? At any rate. So Betsy told you about my winning the World Press Photo Contest in 1965. this is how it all began, and I'll tell the story because it's kind of interesting. The woman at the top is Mrs. Eileen Quinn. She was a civil rights leader in Macomb, Mississippi. Macomb was in the heart of Klan country. She had a beauty shop. She had a motel. She was a woman who had built all this up on her own from nothing. And in this place where it was extremely dangerous to speak out, she spoke out all the time. Her house was guarded day and night by volunteer guardsmen, if you will, people with guns. One night, all the guards went to Jackson for some celebration, and the Klan put a package of dynamite on the front steps and blew up part of the house. Anthony Quinn, 5 years old, was sleeping in her bedroom, and the ceiling came down on him. This was about a month before this picture was taken. So Anthony Quinn was already a civil rights veteran in 5 years. Notice they're all carrying American flags. I described to you the importance of the flag. And this was a day when there were demonstrations all over Jackson. And the civil rights people were trying to fill the jails and break the back of segregation in that one summer. So they started with big demonstrations. They filled the jails. Then the authorities opened the fairgrounds under the blazing sun and began incarcerating people in cattle sheds and cattle enclosures. So tactics changed, and they started doing little guerrilla demonstrations of half a dozen people or less, unannounced. And there was a big press corps in town, and so people had police scanners, so they'd hear something was there, and everybody would rush to that place, and by the time they got there, it was all over. The paddy wagon had come, people were being carted off to jail. So everybody would sit down on the curbs and wait for the next thing. And I was sitting there. I hate press packs. I really don't like to be in that group of journalists. I like to be out on my own. So I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I don't know where the next demonstration is going to occur, except I know it ain't going to be here. So I got up and started walking toward the center of town, and I saw this little flurry of activity out of the south corner of my eye. And it was this. It was Mrs. Quinn and her 4 children, and Dr. June Feiner from the Medical Committee for Human Rights. Dr. Feiner had tried to bring her medical relief to people who were sweltering in the fairgrounds, and the authorities, of course, said you can't go in. She decided the only way I can do my job is to get arrested. So that's why she's there. I mean, she's there with Anthony, but she's there because that's how she's going to get into the fairgrounds. So the police come, and as they leave, the policeman reaches for Anthony's flag. His mother says, "Anthony, don't let that man take your flag." And Anthony, who told me later, he said, "I was more afraid of my mama than I was." Hangs onto the flag. The policeman had probably never had any resistance for a small black child. And he reacted by grabbing the flag, pulling Anthony off his feet, and the deity who looks after photographers sent me in the background this sign, "No more police brutality." So that was the picture. And there's actually video of this. Somebody was there with a camera, and it was much more violent than I remember. I was, with a 24 millimeter lens, I was as close to that action as I am to this podium. Nobody saw me. They were so involved in what was going on. And that was often the case. So that picture followed that patrolman to the end of his days. It was mentioned in his obituary. He never lived it down. I have a certain compassion for that man. You know, he had a moment when he lost control, and it followed him forever. Anthony later said, I wasn't crying because of that policeman. I was crying because he threw me on the ground and hurt me. 5-year-old Anthony is going off to jail. Dr. Feiner is helping him. She went to jail. She got to do her job. And that's the end of the story. I found Anthony a month ago. He's had a long and interesting career. He's now a very handsome middle-aged man in St. Petersburg, Florida. He's a school principal. He has a newly minted PhD. He's done wonderful things with his life. The great migration of American history was not Italian peasants coming from Calabria to the United States or Jews from Eastern Europe. It was black people migrating north out of impossible conditions to northern cities. That story had never been told in 1964. There were no books on it, it had never been appeared in a magazine, and yet this was the great diaspora, American diaspora. So I suggested this in turn to my 3 major clients, Life Look and the Saturday Evening Post. They rejected it. I took the story back, and the next year I sent them a slightly different suggestion. They rejected it. The 3rd year I revised the story again and resubmitted it under a different title. And this time it crossed the desk of the Saturday Evening Post in company with a similar suggestion from one of their editors. I got this phone call. No time to lose, great story, let's get on it right away. So we followed Walter Austin and his family from Cleveland, Mississippi to Springfield, Illinois. People left in the middle of the night. They left in secret because they all owed money to the company store. It was parcel of the sharecropper segregation system, that you never got out of debt. And because you might be illiterate, you didn't know what the accounting was. At the end of the year, when you turned your crops in and got your money, why, it was up to the man what you got paid. And it was always less than you owed. So we spent a month looking for a family to follow. And finally we heard that Walter Austin might be possibly going to move. So Ben Bagdikian and I went to see him. The overseer of the plantation, the owner of the plantation, for whom Walter had worked for 15 years, saw this rental car and a couple of white guys in front of Walter's house. They fired him the next day. So, just on that vision, he never found out why we were there or anything. So we created the migration that we were trying to photograph. The story, Black Migrants, was a lead story in the Post. It was reproduced many times. What hooked me on magazine photography, often your pictures, appeared next to deodorant ads, and you'd work on a great story and it would come down to 2.5 pages. But every once in a while, I could get a story in that really changed folks' lives. First story I did for Look was an 8-page story on a kid who had been hit by a truck and had been reduced to less function than a newborn baby, and was rehabilitated and brought to full life by a new therapy for brain damaged children. I knew the names of children whose parents had read that article and their kids had been saved by it. So I decided, yeah, it's a deeply flawed medium, but it's a great medium in its own way. And so I was willing to encounter all kinds of disappointments for those rare moments with a story like this when you really can make a difference. It's the Austin family in Springfield looking for the first time at all the goodies in stores and so on. Mr. Austin's daughter got a job the first day in Springfield folding clothes in the laundry, making more money than he had in his 15 years of servitude on a plantation in Mississippi. So I threw in a couple of my early photographs of public demonstrations. These are Quakers in front of the Pentagon saying no more atomic testing. And this one slipped in, I don't know how. That's my son talking to a Washington cop. Propaganda. The systematic propagation of a cause or information reflecting the interests of those advocating such a cause. A fairly non-controversial definition, don't you think? This is not Nazism, this is propaganda in the 60s. So these are photographs of the civil rights movement that presented the civil rights movement in a favorable light to people who might want to support it. The summer of '64 saw 1,000, mostly white, college students, mostly from Ivy League colleges, coming south to work in freedom schools, which were schools set up by the civil rights movement to fill in the terrible education that black kids were getting in the South. Their school year was broken by the times when there was harvest. They would let out black schools so all the kids could go work in the fields. And at the other times, they got the establishment white view of race and slavery and politics and so on. So the freedom schools presented a new vision. More than that, they presented to these kids friendship with a white person that they had never imagined would ever be possible in their lives. These encounters changed everybody. The students went back, changed their lives. They turned to careers in law, in medicine, in social service. I just got back 3 weeks ago from the 50th anniversary celebration in Jackson, Mississippi of Freedom Summer. One of the things that happened was that one day folks got up in front of the microphone and told the audience what they were doing. And almost without exception, all these folks had turned to lives of service and social concern. The kids had their horizons raised by these encounters. They had never imagined a friendship with a white person. They didn't know it was possible. Their horizons expanded. They began to see possibilities in their lives that they had never imagined before. The photograph is not in this group, but I photographed in Greenwood, Mississippi, a group of people with a ballot box, clapping their hands and urging black people to register for a mock election. One of the women, 16-year-old Ida Mae Holland, had arrived at the SNCC office a few weeks before as a hooker looking for tricks. She was welcomed non-sexually into the group. They convinced her that her rights were being violated. She became a civil rights worker, dropped her profession, changed her name to Anisha Holland, ended up with a PhD from the University of Buffalo, became a playwright, and wrote a book. That was the way in which, not only that, the anti-Vietnam War movement mostly was generated in Mississippi by the civil rights movement. I don't think I have a picture here. No. I have a picture of Mario Savio taking a bath at a pump behind the Freedom House. Mario Savio went the next fall to Berkeley. It started when he couldn't raise money for SNCC on the Berkeley campus, prevented by authorities. He started the free speech movement, which spread to virtually every college in the United States. Mississippi generated all kinds of change. Late in the movement, 4 SNCC women wrote a letter to SNCC leadership protesting the way they were treated as women in the movement. That was the first statement of the modern women's movement. So all this stuff was generated in this amazing maelstrom that we all unknowingly took part in. This is a science class al fresco on the hood of a car. And again, students and teachers joining in song. And another propaganda photograph, if you will, the vital act, signing a voter registration ballot. In 1965, as a result of the Selma March, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed by Congress, and it stipulated that in every county in the South where there was a pattern of discrimination against voters, federal registrars were sent in to take over the voting process and register folks to vote. That was the real beginning of social change. So those of you who share my feelings about the paralysis of our government today, think about this. 10 days after the Voting Rights Act was signed, Lyndon Johnson had federal registrars in every one of these counties in Mississippi. 10 days. Your government in action. Hunter Maury was beaten by police. And the mayor of Belzoni, Mississippi, it had a heart with a delta shape in the thing you drove under when you drove into Belzoni, the heart of the delta. It was also the heart of segregation. The first 2 black people who tried to register to vote in Belzoni were both shot, one fatally. When I was going into Belzoni, I was really frightened. I called Harding Carter Jr., who later became Lyndon Johnson's press secretary. He was running a paper in Greenville, and I said, "Harding, I'm going into Belzoni. You got any advice for me?" He said, "Belzona." I said, "You know what we say about Belzona in Greenville?" He said, "If you want a carload of sons of bitches, you just back the car up to Belzoni and load on the first 20 men you see." We arrived. The police and the mayor arrived shortly thereafter. The only thing the mayor wanted to know was who we were and did we have press credentials and so on. In the fall of '63, the civil rights groups, to counter the accepted wisdom that our Negros simply don't care about voting, set up a mock ballot, which later became the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, a challenge to the regular Democrats. In 3 months, they organized 80,000 black citizens of Mississippi who voted in a mock election. So these guys came into Belzoni with their ballot box, the place where the only 2 people who tried to register were both shot. And the folks were very scared. And there's another picture I should have here which shows a ballot box on the hood of an Oldsmobile. And they arrested Willie Preacher Shaw for parking too close to a fire hydrant on this dirt road in the middle of a black neighborhood. Another demonstration in Jackson. Notice the policeman is black. They had a couple of black policemen in the Jackson Police Department specifically to deal with situations like this. People resisted arrest nonviolently by lying down and having to be dragged to the paddy wagon. This policeman is about to put his foot down on top of her. And this was called the nigger wagon. It was a sanitation truck that they took people to the fairgrounds in. Notice that nobody seems to be upset by this. They're singing, and this is a victory. They've accomplished what they set out to do, which was to fill the jails. This is an interesting photograph. It's not a great picture, but it's the steps of the federal courthouse and post office in Jackson. This is U.S. property. It's not local property. These are federal marshals. They are cooperating with the Jackson police to enforce illegal anti-demonstration laws in Jackson, throwing this kid down the steps, and so on. So, like the FBI, the federal marshals and other people of the government cooperated with local segregation sheriffs and law enforcement folks to keep things the way they were in the South. That was what we had to contend with. If we were beaten up, there was nobody to call. We had to call Washington. In fact, there's a funny story. Bob Moses, the leader of the civil rights movement in Mississippi, was arrested, I forget where, maybe Greenwood. So he's in jail, and you get one phone call, right? So it's 3 a.m. He calls Bobby Kennedy at his home, who is the Attorney General of the United States, at 3 a.m. It's a collect call. Bobby Kennedy accepts the call, and Bob Moses says, "This is Bob Moses. I'm in jail down here in Mississippi. What are you going to do about it?" And Bobby Kennedy says, "I'll have a Justice Department official there in the morning." The sheriff is outraged by this. So he places a collect call to Bobby Kennedy at 3 a.m. in Washington. The call is refused. Okay, this is the same kid. He's in a chokehold. He's being put in the paddy wagon. He's holding up a sign, "We need federal protection." Who do you think he's holding that sign up for? Who?
Photographer.
Can't hear.
Photographer.
Exactly. I am the only witness. He knows that I'm his only hope to get that message out to the world. Our job as photographers is not to be heroes, not to get beaten up, not to lose our film, not to get our cameras busted. To get the pictures, get out of the situation any way we could. Cowardice, running, pretending to be somebody else, showing a fake press pass, it didn't matter. We had to get to the airport and put the film on a plane. So I thought of myself, I was terrified most of the time I was there. When I had to go into a situation and shoot, I strapped my cameras on like armor plate and became a somewhat different person. And I could then go into situations and do things that I was too frightened to do otherwise. Because A, I knew I was photographing history, and B, I had a role, which was to be a witness and to get those pictures out so the rest of the world could witness what was happening. Social documentary. A documentary photographer, Dorothea told me, is not unprejudiced, but he must not photograph his prejudice. We all had our points of view. If you were going to reflect life as it was, you tried to do it as objectively as you could. It's impossible to be objective, but we tried our best. So, in the spring of 1964, when the civil rights groups were planning to bring these 1,000 privileged kids into Mississippi, I was thinking, what can I do? And I tried to start a documentary project a few years earlier and failed. People were interested in it, but we were looking for a Roy Stryker, a leader for the project. And we couldn't find anybody because although a lot of people thought it was a great idea, they were all busy, they were doing other things, and who cares about civil rights anyway? So this time I thought, maybe I can do it here. I went to New York, I tried to raise money. I recruited photographers. Dorothea gave me some good leads, and I got a few people from her. But I was totally unable to raise any money. I am a terrible promoter. And I finally went into the office of Black Star, which was the major magazine picture agency in those days. And I poured out my anguish to Howard Chapnick, the director of the project. And I said, it's getting late, I've got to get back to Mississippi, I don't have any money, I want to do this, I can't pay anybody. He said, well, how much money do you need? I said, well, I could get by with $10,000. He got on the phone and raised the money in 20 minutes. And I was like, why didn't I do this before? Anyway, so 5 of us, we started out with 7, and I fired 2 guys in the middle of the summer who were just causing trouble. 5 of us spent those 8 or 10 weeks following what was happening, but also trying to document life as it was lived in the South. This is the Mississippi Delta in winter, mud and poverty. This is a church of a sharecroppers church in Valley View, Mississippi. Church was the one day of the week when these folks could give and receive respect. On that day, they wore their best clothes. They addressed each other as Mr. Green and Mrs. Williams. On the other days, they were Johnny and Maisie to their white overseers. This was the day in which they rebuilt their sense of themselves, their respect, their pride. It all happened on Sunday. Sunday was the most important day of the week. These are men gathering before church. This is the deacon listening to the sermon. They were very poor. They could afford a preacher once a month. So this was a big moment for them. They actually had a preacher explaining the word to them. Notice a white summer volunteer, the only white face in the church. And this is the church, and after church, a local sharecropper with his team of mules is taking his family home. And my favorite photograph of all, a bunch of boys gathering after church in the back, standing in a grove of trees. I said to them simply, why don't you stand there and I'll take your picture? They grouped themselves almost as a social society. If you look, the kids on the outside are not as well dressed. They don't quite know whether they belong there. The older guys in the back, they don't quite trust me, so they're not in the front. But in the front are the well-dressed kids who are proud of their appearance, and they say, take my picture. Years later, the minister of this church told me some of his parishioners walked the dusty roads to church barefoot, carrying their freshly polished shoes in their hands so they would be spotless when they put them on for church. I put these two photographs together because I like the way they play off each other. You see them together in the show if you go and look at it. How many of you have seen or read The Help? This is The Help. These are the matrons of Jackson, Mississippi. They are there because their daughters are competing in the Miss Mississippi contest. One of them will be anointed with a sash over herself. And they've created all of these things to eat. And I went there because I wanted to, I wanted not only to photograph Black society, but white society. I wanted to see what people look like. This kind of says it all. You could live in a colonial mansion with white pillars on the backs of black labor. It's hard to see here, but there's a little sign that says Lawn of Month. It was an award from the Jackson Garden Club. Who made it the Lawn of Month? This guy. That doesn't need any introduction. And I photographed a march in Bogalusa, Louisiana, and this woman appeared with her sign, "Nigger, don't you wish you were white?" That was her belief. I'm sure she lettered that sign on her kitchen table. And I love her daughters. They haven't got a clue what's going on. For a brief moment, we were cooperating. She wanted me to take her picture. I wanted to take her picture. So we worked together to get that photograph. I hated her sentiments. I'm sure she hated mine. But at that moment, we were working together. I have a certain respect for that woman. She was not afraid to say what she believed, even though it was hateful. So this was a time assignment to photograph the inauguration of Paul Johnson, who was the governor of Mississippi. And so Time published a nice head and shoulders of Johnson giving his inaugural speech. But I came into this situation feeling as if I'd landed on the surface of Mars. I had never seen anything like this. I had never seen these small town politicians with their badges that said they were an honorary colonel, or the guy who's suffering from sunstroke, or any of the rest of it. So I shot for Time, but I was also shooting for myself. And I hoped for history, trying to make sense of this, to me, very strange and weird scene. And I was invisible. I had credentials. Nobody paid any attention to me. I went where I wanted to be, did what I wanted, with my social documentary antenna waving furiously in the air. Black sanitation workers watching beauty queens on their floats. I call this, you can't quite see it, but the sign up there says advanced training. That's my title for the picture. Governor George Wallace announcing his candidacy for the President of the United States at a rural rally in Georgia. Wallace and his supporters taking the measure of the crowd before he speaks. And Wallace supporters, my two favorite ladies. And the other folks. Country folks who think maybe Wallace will bring them real change. And the Goldwater rally in New Orleans. This woman would be a member of the Tea Party today, but there was no Tea Party then. But people talked about the backlash against Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. So she says, here's the backlash. And that's kind of where I usually end civil rights pictures. To me, that represents where we were all trying to go. And that's a summer volunteer with one of her students. So you'll have to bear with me a little bit. I'll tell you a little bit about what I did afterward. That's probably the first good photograph I ever took. It was in Jerusalem. I taught for 2 years on the West Bank in a little town called Ramallah, which is now the center of Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. These are Coptic priests who were thrown out of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in some religious controversy 2 centuries before. And they moved to huts on the roof of the church because they said, we ain't going to leave. And generation after generation, they lived there, doing mostly nothing, I think. Women on the street in Cairo. And my teacher, Lina White, a noted teacher of photography. I spent 6 months as his private student. Not a great picture, but and there I am shooting in the French Quarter of New Orleans. I went to Dallas the day Kennedy was shot. I got out of bed, threw cameras into a bag, went to the airport, called my editor on the way and said, I'm going to Dallas. And he said, of course. The Dallas police station was amazing. There were thousands of press there, all the networks, cameras everywhere. They would bring Oswald out of the interrogation room through the hall, and there would be this huge crush. I would be lifted off my feet, and I'd be winding film through my Nikon, holding it over my head. I had trouble with the story that was being fed to us. Oswald was a lone assassin, there was no conspiracy. And that evening I was trying to figure out, why did all these other guys kind of accept what they were hearing and I didn't? It came to me, I'm looking at Texas through Mississippi eyes. That became the title of my book. Mississippi eyes meant that I had learned that things said to me by officials were not necessarily true. It should be treated with extreme skepticism. And those of us who were there learned to see the world through Mississippi eyes. And when we left that special place, we carried those eyes with us. And I still look at the world through Mississippi eyes. So, Rampart said, Jim Garrison, the district attorney of New Orleans, is bringing a case against Clay Shaw, who was Oswald's handler while he was in New Orleans. It's the only legal trial to come out of the Kennedy assassination. And can I go on? I'm right on the hour now. Okay. Feel free to leave if you're bored. So Garrison, I said, I've got this assignment, I need to take a picture of you. And Garrison said, I'm very busy, can you do it in 4 minutes? I said, sure. I went to his home. I thought he was involved in kind of a chess game, and I knew he was a chess player. I said, let's play chess. set up a board, and he beat me in 4 moves. I'm moving. Taking pictures. And in the conversation, he said, "Who do you think did it?" Oh, I was talking all the time I was shooting them. I was talking about the assassination because some of my friends became the first critics of the Warren Commission. He said, "Who do you think did it?" I said, "I think it was generated from within the administration, and the focus was Vietnam." Kennedy had already begun removing the first American advisors from Vietnam and had plans to withdraw. And Garrison said, "Nah, it was an anti-Castro plot that turned 180 degrees." 6 weeks later, he gave a press conference and he said, "The plot was generated within the U.S. government and the focus is Vietnam." Not because I told him that, because he saw this, he was looking at the same stuff I was looking at. So I worked for 3 years, and when he lost the trial and everything fell down, I said, "It's time to get out of the country." We had a small sailboat, a 31-foot steel sloop, and my wife and I and our 2 kids sailed from New Orleans to the west coast of Africa and spent a year going down the coast. We did a book called The Voyage of Aquarius, and we've just finished another book called Our Big Blue Schoolhouse about educating children at sea. So that was our boat. Those are my kids. We called that foredeck jumping. The boat would go up on a wave. The kids would be launched into the air. They had ropes to the head stay. It was one of their games. They're on a small 31-foot boat in the middle of the ocean. You have to invent games. That's our first book. While our landfall across the Atlantic was the Azores, and we spent 2 months in Horta in the Azores. And while we were there, I joined a whale hunt. The fishermen of the Azores had learned to whale from New Bedford whalers a century before. And they continued in that ancient tradition using sailing canoes, hand-launched harpoons, and killing sperm whale. There's the critical moment. They've taken the whale down and he's about to launch a harpoon. I photographed 2 whale hunts, both of which were unsuccessful. When dusk fell, they had to cut the line, and the whale got away. But I saw something I didn't expect. The pod of whales gathered around the injured whale. They didn't flee. They gathered around to give that whale support. And I began to sense there's a mind in those waters and what's going on. So it's the flensing deck of the whaling station. So a couple of years later, back in the United States, a friend called me and she said, "There's a bunch of hippies in Vancouver who are going to put their bodies between the harpoons and the whales." My journalist mind said, that's an image that could stop whaling. So I called them, and I said, "I'm a photographer, I'd like to come join you." And they said, "We've got 40 photographers who want to come join us." I said, "I've sailed a small boat across the Atlantic, I can navigate, I know how to manage vessels at sea." They said, "How soon can you get on the plane?" So I joined the first 2 Greenpeace anti-whaling voyages as a bridge officer, whaling photographer, and navigator. I was the only person who knew how to navigate. This is a Russian whaling ship, the Vostok. This is another photographer, and that's the way we operated. We had a rope around our waist and we stood up in the zodiac, sometimes going 20 knots. And you were above the spray, and you could photograph from that platform. It was interesting. At any rate, the first year, it's a little backwards. After the first year, they had one encounter with the Russian whaling fleet. I wrote an article for Smithsonian. I called it Ahab's Children. Smithsonian, in their infinite wisdom, called it a not altogether quixotic face-off with Soviet whalers in the Pacific. I still think Ahab's Children is a better title. So, the editor told me this got the most read response of any article in Smithsonian's history. And the money poured in. It was the first time Greenpeace had any money. So the next year we rented a 150-foot decommissioned Canadian minesweeper and had one encounter on the way to Hawaii and another 1,000 miles north of Hawaii in the North Pacific. The next year at the annual Whaling Commission in London, they banned whaling. Not all whaling, unfortunately. But that image of human beings putting their bodies in the way of harpoons to save whales was so powerful that eventually ended most of whaling, unfortunately not all of it. A few years later, one of my Greenpeace buddies chartered a 150-foot North Sea fishing trawler, renamed it the Sea Shepherd, and set off in December for the ice flows of the St. Lawrence to try and stop a harp seal hunt. These are newborn baby harp seal pelts. They were clubbed to death on the ice floes by New Bedford whalers, or not whalers, sealers. And these lovely white coats were sold for furs. We punched through pack ice in the Gulf of St. Lawrence for a couple of days, shadowed by a Canadian icebreaker, the Wolf. And they expected to arrest us in the morning. So we started out in survival suits across the ice in a full gale. I had press printed in big letters on the back of my survival suit. I was on assignment for Geo. In the morning, they carried, you can see the tank there, they carried flasks of fluorescent dye, which they would rub into the pelts of the seal pups, which didn't hurt the pups, but it destroyed the value of the pelt as fur. In the morning, 5 helicopters of the Mounties came overhead, and we were eventually all busted and ended up in jail in the Magdalen Islands. That's our jailer. I remember his name was Andre. We had to run the gauntlet of sealers when we got off the choppers and into the jail. They were beating us with seal pelts. I was never so happy to be in jail in my life. Later, I lived near San Francisco, the heart of the AIDS epidemic, and friends of mine were hospice workers with AIDS patients. And I became fascinated with what was happening. This was before the virus was identified. I mean, people still thought the CIA was introducing the infection through the ventilation systems of gay bars. So I did an article for Whole Earth News on AIDS, and it was used by public health services in a couple of states to orient their people to the epidemic. And then I worked with Cleve Jones, who set up something called the Names Project in San Francisco. And people made quilts in memory of friends of theirs who had died. And they collected the quilts, and they had a big display on the Washington Mall of all the quilts. It was like a funeral service or a memorial service. People came and prayed in front of the quilts of friends they'd lost or lovers they'd lost. And for me, it was the most intense day of photographing since the Summer March. You can see the Capitol building in the background. So that fall, as a result of the display, Simon & Schuster decided to do a book, Stories from the Names Project. And Cleve decided that the people working on the book should all be straight because he wanted the book to appeal to a wider audience. He didn't want it just to be, collected among gays. So I became a photographer, and it was stories, it was mainly pictures of the quilts and stories of them. So then at a certain point I became board member and then president of the American Society of Media Photographers, which represents most of the best photographers in this country who shoot for publication. So this is my life as a labor organizer. And I ski. And I fly gliders. And my son flies gliders. 2 weeks ago, we finished a contest in Nevada. He took a fourth, I took a fifth. And I started playing the bass. So, that's it. You have questions? Anybody raise their hand? Yes.
Have you ever done any follow-up on people who photograph themselves March and things to know what they're doing today, or the migrant family, what happened to them in the next generation, or anything like that?
I'd like to do that. It's hard to find people. Elizabeth Partridge, who will talk to you in the afternoon, went to Selma and she identified that kid with a vote on his forehead. It's hard. My one success was finding Anthony Quinn. And I think I'm going to write an article about Anthony in that photograph. So I'd like to, and mostly no. Other questions?
How do you
Yes.
separate your own personal feelings from what you were photographing?
That's a very good question.
What was it?
How did I separate my own feelings from what I was photographing? There's a certain discipline to being a photographer in these situations. And if you are emotionally, I was emotionally hooked to the civil rights movement. I was there heart and soul. But with those cameras on, I had to maintain a distance. First of all, if your emotions are overrunning you, you may not see the pictures. Secondly, if you're in a dangerous situation, you need to keep your wits about you. But also, I knew I was photographing history, and there's a little part of my brain that's saying F8 at 100th of a second. Particularly in those days, we didn't have automatic cameras. So all that's going on, and you have to withdraw a little bit in order to be a witness, not a participant. As I said before, if you were beaten up and jailed, you were not a hero, you were a chump because you were not doing your job, my job, which was to witness and get the film out. So the answer is yes, I was involved emotionally, and no, I had to create a space in order to do my work.
And then take one more question. We'll take
In the back there?
You said something about these, when you took that picture of the governor-elect
Yeah.
of Mississippi, they were honorary colonels. Are you talking about at the Ku Klux Klan?
No, not really. They were, the Klan was mostly farmers, rednecks, and so on. There were two groups. There were the white Citizens Council members who were businessmen and so on. And they supported the police in what they did. They probably gave covert support to the Klan. But they were the respectable face of the Klan. These men were probably aldermen and mayors and so on of various Mississippi towns. They were respectable folks. And they didn't go out and burn churches at night. 35 churches were burned during the summer of 1964, black churches. So they were just, that was, you know, their way of being rewarded for being part of the group.
All right, I think we're gonna wrap it up. I have to get Matt, he's going back to San Francisco here in a few, actually not very long, less than 2 hours, so we're gonna get him to Cedar Rapids. His books are for sale in the gift shop. We're gonna be in here for a few minutes breaking down, if Matt doesn't mind, you can pop back in and sign. Elizabeth Partridge will be talking here in the auditorium at 2 o'clock. If you bought a ticket today, you can come back for Elizabeth Partridge as well. And she'll be screening part of Dorothea Lange's new movie, Grab a Hunk of Lightning, and it's not going to be on television until August 29th, so it's an extra special treat. And she'll be talking about Dorothea's work, and her and Matt did a book together as well. So back at 2 o'clock if you guys would like to come.
It's a great show, folks. You should come. Thank you. I enjoyed talking.